Tamed by the Rogue, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Blood in the Snow. The storm came from the mountains like a living thing, howling, clawing, erasing everything it touched. Lyra staggered through it, cloak shredded, breath sharp as shards of glass. Snow clung to her lashes, melting in frightened tears. Behind her, the forest growled. Not the wind this time. Wolves. Too many to count. The moon was a blur above her, a pale wound in the black sky. Every instinct screamed to run, yet her legs refused to obey. The cold had crept into her bones. Somewhere deep inside, Syl, her dormant wolf, stirred and whimpered, but did not rise. The bond between them was a broken thread, silent. She had never been outside the Bloodfang walls before today. Never breathed air that wasn't filtered by duty and expectation. Her father had said the forest beyond their borders was death itself. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was what freedom really cost. A branch cracked to her right. She spun, half expecting her father's guards to drag her back to the ceremony she had fled, back to Garen's waiting hand, his polished smile, the promise of a bond forged in obedience. But it wasn't a guard. It wasn't even a man. The thing that stepped through the snow looked carved from shadow. Broad shoulders, dark hair matted with frost, eyes reflecting the faintest burn of amber. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Lyra's throat locked. Her instincts screamed a name before her mind did. Rogue. He was wrong in every way. Wrong in how he stood. Wrong in how the snow seemed to avoid touching him. The mark on his neck glowed faintly, the old Exile brand of Bloodfang. She had heard stories of him since childhood, the monster who killed the Alpha's son, the wolf who had been cast out and had never died. Calvin. He came closer, slow as a predator who already knew she couldn't run. His voice, when it came, was low, hoarse, as if unused for years. "You're bleeding." Lyra flinched, stepping back. He didn't chase, he simply crouched, tearing a strip from his sleeve, and dropped it into the snow between them. A crude offering. A choice. The silence between them stretched. Wind screamed through the trees. Somewhere behind her, the rival pack's howls split the night, ashen fangs closing in. Calvin turned his head slightly, listening. "They'll find you in minutes," he said, eyes never leaving hers. "You smell like royalty." "I'm not." The lie caught on her tongue. He raised one brow and the rest of her words froze. He didn't ask her name, didn't need to, he could smell what she was. Bloodfang Alpha's line. Then something happened. A heartbeat, small and sharp like a spark leaping between two cold stones. Her vision blurred for a fraction of a second. The world snapping into focus around him. His scent, earth, smoke, iron, coiled through her chest, lighting something she didn't understand. The air between them cracked with invisible current. He stiffened. She saw it in the tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, the same recognition, the same impossible truth. The mate bond. Lyra stumbled back as if struck. Calvin rose, slow, deliberate, his expression unreadable. "No," he muttered almost to himself. "Not her." He turned away from her then toward the trees. For a moment she thought he would vanish, leave her to the storm and the approaching hunters. But instead he stopped, his head tilted wolf-like, listening again. Then, without looking back, he said, "If you want to live, follow me." She hesitated only a second. The howls behind her answered for her. She followed. They moved through the snow in silence, branches lashing at her arms, breath clouding the air between them. Calvin led her through paths invisible to her eyes, narrow trails hidden beneath fallen pines, tunnels of ice and bark. He never looked back, yet somehow he knew when she stumbled, slowing his pace just enough to let her catch up. After what felt like hours, the forest opened into a hollow, a ring of frost-bitten trees encircling a single structure, a cabin, small and broken, half buried in snow. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney, but she could feel warmth inside, faint and fading. Calvin pushed open the door and stepped aside. She entered without thinking. The cabin smelled of pine, rust, and loneliness. Everything was stripped bare, except for a bed, a stone hearth, and a table covered in old maps. The wind hissed through cracks in the walls. When the door closed, silence swallowed them whole. Calvin tossed a log into the hearth and struck flint until sparks caught. The fire rose weakly, shadows climbing up his face. He looked older in the flicker, haunted, but not cruel. Just hollow. Lyra tried to speak, but her voice was raw. "You're the rogue." He didn't deny it, he didn't confirm it either, he only said, "You shouldn't be here." "I didn't plan to be." That almost drew a smirk. Almost. The warmth began to seep into her fingers, slow and biting. She wanted to ask what he planned to do with her. Kill her, ransom her, leave her. But something in his expression silenced her. He was studying her, not as prey, but as a riddle. Her gaze caught on a small tarnished object hanging from the wall. A collar, old and cracked, engraved with a name she could barely read. The sight made her stomach twist. She wondered whose name it was. Calvin followed her glance, his jaw tightening. "Don't touch that." "I wasn't going to." He looked at her for a long moment, then turned away. The fire snapped between them, casting its light in restless patterns across his scarred hands. Outside, the wind died. For the first time, the forest was silent. She realized then that he hadn't locked the door. It was an odd mercy, one that made her chest ache more than any cruelty would have. She could leave if she wanted. But when she looked at him, this exile who had become every story she'd been warned about, she didn't move. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the bond's pull, that electric thread humming beneath her skin. Or maybe it was the strange comfort in his stillness, the way even his silence felt like protection. Lyra sat by the fire, trembling. Calvin stood guard by the door, eyes scanning the trees through the cracks in the wood. Neither spoke again, and in the hollow of that cabin where the storm had no voice, the first fragile thread between them began to form, woven from fear, warmth, and something far more dangerous, something not dead. Chapter 2. Something Not Dead. Morning never arrived in the Howling Wilds the way it did elsewhere. Light came thin and reluctant, diluted by clouds so thick it felt like the forest exhaled gloom. When Lyra opened her eyes, the world was gray, not gold, and cold still lived in her bones. The cabin was silent. Only the fire cracked quietly, a weary heart refusing to die. Her limbs ached as she sat up on the creaking mattress, thin blanket sliding to the floor. At some point in the night, she must have shifted closer to the hearth without knowing it, an unconscious drift toward warmth in a place where nothing else welcomed her. She blinked hard. Calvin was gone. No sound. No trail of boots across the wooden floor. The door stood half ajar, snow curling over the threshold in fine, powdery drifts. For a moment, a single foolish thought struck her. He left me. But then came the scent. Sharp pine and ash, iron and storm. He hadn't gone far. She stood wincing as cold bit at her feet, and wrapped the blanket around her like a second skin. The floor moaned under her weight as she stepped toward the maps on the table. Ink-stained and weather-worn, they weren't just routes. They were patterns, movements of packs, territory shifts, supply caches. Her eyes caught the curling edge of a name scribbled in the corner. Bloodfang. Her home, marked not with pride, but caution. Another map had notes in a different hand, shakier with small smudges where ink had bled, like someone had written in the cold. One name repeated, circled 3 times. Cassian. She reached for it. "Don't touch that." His voice came low and steady from the doorway. She hadn't heard him return. Snow clung to his shoulders, melting in dark streaks across his shirt. His expression was unreadable, but his body stilled like a wolf, scenting danger. Lyra let her hand fall. It's your brother, isn't it? No. A pause, then he shut the door with his foot, a soft thud. He was your alpha's son. Lyra turned slowly to face him. The weight in his eyes was heavier than accusation. It was memory, not nostalgia, not grief. Just the weight of something that refused to die. I know the story, she said softly. They said you killed him. I didn't. He crossed to the hearth, knelt, and began stacking more wood. The flames hissed against the damp bark. He said nothing else. She waited, but no more words came. Apparently, that was all the truth he was willing to offer. Calvin moved like the silence belonged to him. Not awkwardly, never that, but like a creature made for it. The space between them didn't feel empty. It felt filled with everything they weren't saying. Her eyes dropped to the collar hanging on the wall, the same one she'd noticed the night before. The leather was cracked, but the engraving caught the dim light. It wasn't a name. It was a rank. Beta-born. You grew up in the pack, she murmured. His jaw clenched as he stood. I was raised to obey the system, until I saw what it did to the ones who couldn't fight it. He didn't look at her. He stared into the fire, lost in it. Lyra didn't know if he meant Cassian or himself. She stepped back from the table, wrapping the blanket tighter. A chill had crept in again, not from the cold, but from the realization that she had entered a house built not just from wood, but from secrets that had been left to rot. Calvin crossed to the far wall, lifted a wooden crate, and tossed a bundle of fabric onto the bed. It unfolded in the air. Pants, boots, a coat too big for her, but lined. Yours? Old. That was as much answer as she'd get. She dressed behind the partial wall that separated the bed from the hearth. The coat smelled of dust and pine, the faintest trace of him woven in. Not fresh, not worn in years. When she emerged, he was cleaning a blade at the table, slow and methodical. The silence stretched again. Her presence didn't bother him, but it didn't comfort him either. He wasn't used to company, that much was clear. You could have traded me back by now, she said at last. His hand stilled. Just a fraction. Then resumed. They'd pay for me, she added. My father would offer territory to get me back. Garen would offer blood. He didn't look up. And you think I want either of those things? She had no answer for that. She turned toward the window. Frost crept across the glass, the outside world smeared in fog and ice. Somewhere out there, wolves waited. Not his, not hers. Just wild things that killed what they couldn't use. She leaned her forehead to the cold glass. Her breath fogged it in quiet bursts. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. I didn't know what it felt like, to have the bond stir. He said nothing, but she could feel it. His presence sharpening behind her, the air thickening like breath before a storm. I always thought it'd be fire, she said, or lightning, not quiet. Still no response, but in the reflection she caught the slightest shift. His fingers had stopped moving. The blade rested against the wood, forgotten. The silence inside me, it's never gone, she whispered. Not until yesterday. This time she didn't need to look, she felt him looking at her. The fire cracked. Snow tapped at the roof like distant claws. The silence between them remained. But it wasn't empty anymore. Chapter 3. Echoes of Teeth. The wind had teeth again. Lyra woke before dawn to the sound of it gnawing at the cabin walls. The fire had died to embers. Pale blue light stretched its fingers across the floorboards, painting frost in long, slow strokes. Her breath emerged in visible wisps and the blanket clung to her skin, damp with cold sweat. She hadn't dreamed, but her body felt hunted, like something had watched her all night. Calvin wasn't inside. For a moment, panic surged, a flash of abandonment rooted not in logic, but in instinct. The bond stirred in her ribs, a hollow ache, searching for a presence it hadn't asked for and didn't want, but now seemed to crave in silence. She pushed off the blanket, dressed quickly in the 2 large clothes he'd given her, and stepped outside. Snow stretched in every direction, thick and unbroken. The trees loomed like guards with bowed heads. And there he was, a lone figure crouched in the snow beside the woodpile, blade in hand, carving long, deliberate cuts into the ice-covered bark of a stump. It wasn't firewood he was shaping, it was a name. She watched him for a while before he noticed her, his movements rhythmic, mechanical, like he carved not to remember but to hold something at bay. When he did glance back, he didn't speak. He didn't have to. The same cold fire burned in his eyes, the one she now recognized as grief, with nowhere to go. Lyra moved toward him slowly. Her boots crunched softly over the snow. When she reached the stump, she could finally read the word carved into the wood. Cassian. The lines were deep, almost angry. A wound turned outward. "You keep writing it," she said softly, voice hoarse from sleep and frost. "Why?" Calvin didn't look up. "Because forgetting it doesn't make it untrue." His fingers tightened around the blade. She could see the tiny tremble in his wrist, a rare imperfection. He'd been working too long, or too hard. "You were close." He gave a small nod, more movement than agreement. "He trusted me." The name hung between them, not just a memory but a fracture that had never healed. Lyra had grown up hearing about Cassian, the Golden Sun, killed by Betrayal, his death the match that lit a purge. But standing beside Calvin now, she saw none of that glory in the carved letters. Just raw absence. "He told me something before he died," Calvin murmured. "Something I didn't understand until too late. He begged me not to tell anyone." Her breath caught. "Not even the Alpha?" "Especially not him." There was weight to that, enough to tilt her balance. Lyra stepped back, eyes drifting from the stump to the forest edge. The trees looked darker than before. Watching. Listening. "How long were you out here alone?" she asked. Calvin didn't answer right away. He stood, wiped the blade clean on his sleeve, and slid it into a sheath at his side. The wind picked up then, curling around them both like a warning. "Too long," he said finally. Long enough for silence to start sounding like peace. They returned to the cabin without another word. Inside, she fed the fire while he removed the snow-caked coat and hung it near the hearth. The warmth crawled back into the room inch by inch. Her hands tingled with returning feeling. She noticed for the first time the faint marks on the cabin walls, scratches near the door, grooves on the floor, gouges too deliberate to be accidents. Not recent, not chaotic. Controlled violence, not just survival, a fight. "Your wolf," she said quietly. "Does he speak to you?" Calvin didn't look up from the tools he was cleaning. "He used to." "Not anymore?" "He's quiet now." A pause. "But not gone." Lyra felt the hairs on her neck rise. She had never truly known Syl's voice. Only flickers, sensations in moments of fear, instinctive turns. What would it be like to hear her clearly? To have her wake fully? "You're not like the others," she said, "not even before Exile. That's why they hated me." The fire cracked, a sharp snap of sap exploding. Lyra flinched. Calvin didn't move. She crossed to the hearth, crouched beside it, and stared into the flames. Their light made her feel transparent. Small. "There's a cellar," he said after a long silence, "and if they come, ashen fangs, blood fangs, I don't care which. You go down and stay there." She turned to him. "What about you?" His eyes lifted, steady and unreadable. "I don't run." Something cold pressed into her chest at the way he said it, not pride, not courage. Just fact. She wanted to ask why he hadn't turned her in yet, why he hadn't claimed her as leverage and moved on. The bond didn't control thoughts, only instincts. He could have used her. He still might. Instead, he handed her a folded strip of fabric, a clean cloth, soft and worn at the edges. "Your shoulder," he said. She touched it, still sore from the run, the fall, the bruises left by claws and panic. She hadn't noticed how raw the skin had become beneath her coat. She took the cloth and nodded. It wasn't kindness. It was preparation. He wanted her strong. For what, she still didn't know. That night she lay beneath the blanket again, curled on her side near the fire. Calvin didn't sleep. He sat in the wooden chair by the door, blade on his lap, eyes half closed, but never dreaming. She watched the collar on the wall through slitted eyes, the shadows it cast like twin fangs above the hearth. And outside, far in the forest, the wolves howled. Not in hunger, not in triumph, but they were looking for something or someone. And she realized, with a sick twist of certainty, that they would come this way next. Chapter 4. Wolves don't cry. The snow fell quieter that morning, but the silence felt heavier. Not peace. Wait. Like something unseen had settled over the forest, pressing into the roof of the cabin, warping the air between its walls. Lyra watched frost gather along the window pane, white veins creeping like slow fire. Her body ached in small, mean ways. Bruises bloomed where she'd fallen days ago, stiff joints, a sharp throb under her ribs when she breathed too deeply. Still she moved, slow and stubborn, stretching the blanket across her shoulders as she crossed the room. Calvin was outside again, his coat dark with melted snow, axe sunk into a stump. He worked without rhythm, as if the motion was enough. Swing, crack, reset. The wood splintered in clean breaks, scattered across the ground in frozen shards. He hadn't looked at her once since sunrise. Lyra pushed the door open. The cold bit through the air like needles, sharp and immediate. She stepped into the snow barefoot, wincing at the sudden sting, but didn't retreat. "You said they'd come," she murmured, the ashen fangs. Calvin didn't turn. Another swing, another crack. "They're not here yet. But they will be." He pulled the axe free, set the blade aside. For a long moment, he simply stood with his back to her. Then, "They don't track like blood fangs. They wait, they surround, and when the snow turns heavy enough to muffle screams, they come in." Lyra swallowed hard. Her gaze shifted to the tree line, just shadows between branches, motionless, watching. She couldn't see anything, but something in her gut twisted. They were already close. Her feet numbed, she forced herself not to move. "Teach me." He finally turned. The lines of his face were carved in shadow, his breath fogging slow and even. His eyes narrowed. "What?" "Teach me what it means to shift, what it means to be a wolf." Calvin looked at her a long while, the way one might study a snare to see if it had teeth. His silence pressed harder than any refusal. But when he moved, it wasn't away. It was toward the woods. She followed. They didn't speak again as they walked. The snow thickened beneath the canopy, old pines heavy with weight, their needles bowing like prayer. He led her to a half-frozen creek, where the water still moved sluggish and black beneath the surface. He stopped and pointed to the clearing beyond it. "There." She stepped past him, wind teasing at her hair, her breath catching in her throat. The space was ringed with trees, their bark marked by claws, deep, layered, old. A training place, maybe, or something else. Calvin circled her slowly, soundless in the snow. "Close your eyes." She did. "Now breathe." The command came low, not cruel, but stripped of softness. Lyra obeyed, pulling air deep into her lungs. It hurt. Too sharp. Too dry. Again. She did it again. And again. Until her breath matched the cold. Until she stopped noticing the snow biting her arms or the wind threading through her hair. "Where is your wolf?" His voice drifted around her like smoke. Not close, not far. She couldn't say. "I don't know." Then stopped listening for words. Her pulse skipped. "Feel her," he said. "Not with your ears, not with your mind. Below that. Lower. Like a pull in your spine." Lyra stood still. Wind curled around her throat, then down her back, sliding beneath her coat like fingers. Her chest tightened, not in fear. Something else. Something deeper, older, A flicker, not a thought, not a voice. Just the sense that something inside her had turned its head. She gasped. Calvin was watching. She could feel him, but he didn't speak. Didn't move. Syl. The name formed not on her tongue, but in her bones. For a second, the forest blurred. Not physically, spiritually, as if something inside her had shifted to a lower place in the world, closer to the earth, closer to hunger. She tasted the trees, smelled the cold rot beneath the snow. Then it vanished, gone. Just her heartbeat too loud. Her breathing uneven. "I lost her," she whispered. "She's not a pet," he said. "She doesn't come when called. She comes when you need her." Lyra opened her eyes. Her legs trembled. She felt raw, not weak, just unshielded. Like her skin had thinned. "Again," Calvin said. They stayed in that clearing until the light began to die. Again. Again. She stood still until her knees buckled, until her body no longer asked her permission to fall. When she collapsed into the snow, he didn't help her up. He crouched beside her, pulled off his coat, and laid it across her shoulders. She didn't protest. She couldn't. Her cheek pressed to the ice, the world spinning softly. "I hate him," she said. The words just came. "My father." Calvin didn't react. "Not because he's cruel," she whispered, "but because he thinks I belong to someone." Still nothing, but the silence felt less distant now, less guarded. Back in the cabin, she collapsed onto the bed without changing. Snow melted from her boots onto the floor. Her fingers stung with returning warmth. She barely registered the sound of firewood being stacked, or the door closing. When she opened her eyes again, hours had passed. The fire was high. Her hands were wrapped, not expertly, but carefully. Calvin sat in his chair, awake, watching. His presence no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a storm waiting to be named. She closed her eyes again, and for the first time since the bond sparked, she didn't fight the weight of him in the room. She just let it be. Chapter 5. Ties that burn. The air was warmer, not by much, but enough to unsettle. Lyra stood by the cabin window, her hands pressed against the frost-laced glass. The snow outside had crusted over, glossy and brittle, and the trees stood strangely still, like something had hushed them. No wind, no birds, no tracks. Just quiet, but not peace. Something had shifted. She didn't know what. Only that her skin felt too tight and her thoughts too loud. Behind her, Calvin moved through the room with deliberate quiet, arranging supplies, sharpened blades, strips of dried meat, a coil of rope, a small silver case she didn't recognize. Everything he did had purpose. Even silence seemed like a tool in his hands. "You're preparing for something." Her voice sounded foreign in the thick quiet. He didn't look up from the blade he was oiling. "Always am. That's not what I meant." He set the blade down, turned the cloth in his hands. One edge frayed, stained dark. She wondered if it was blood, or ink, or time. She didn't ask. The maps were still spread across the table. More had been added. Lyra crossed the room and hovered near them, careful not to touch. Her eyes followed the lines, routes marked with ticks, red ink looping around old bloodfang borders. Dotted trails cut through the wilds like scars. "You've been tracking them." She didn't need to say who. He didn't answer, but the truth lived in the tension in his shoulders. Ashen Fangs, Bloodfang Scouts, and Garen. She reached for the corner of one map and paused. There, tucked beneath it, was a folded page. Thicker paper, worn at the edges. She didn't mean to open it, but her fingers moved on instinct. The paper crackled softly as it unfolded. It wasn't a map. It was a letter, or what was left of one, water-damaged with words bleeding into one another. But the name at the bottom was still clear. Cassian. Calvin's hand closed over hers before she could read more. The contact froze her. Not the touch itself, rough skin, calloused palm, but the jolt beneath it, a pressure, a pull, like something buried deep inside her spine had just reached up in recognition. His fingers didn't tighten, but they didn't let go. Lyra looked up. Calvin's face was unchanged, still unreadable, but his eyes burned in that awful, beautiful way again. Not anger, not even warning. Just fire without a name. She didn't move. The bond stirred between them like smoke. Not sudden, not violent. Just there. Thick and present. A heat she hadn't asked for but now couldn't seem to pull away from. He released her hand without a word, turned from her, stepped back. The distance reasserted itself, cold and immediate, but it was too late. Something had cracked open between them. Lyra exhaled, slow, measured. Her skin still hummed with something she couldn't name. Her gaze drifted again to the letter. This time she didn't try to read it. "I'm not a bargaining chip," she said. He didn't answer. She crossed to the hearth, sat without asking. The fire was low. It hadn't been fed in hours. She reached for the kindling but paused when she saw the marks carved into the stone beneath the grate. Initials, clawed in rather than written, too deep to be forgotten, too raw to be decorative. "Why keep this place?" she asked softly, "if all it holds is ghosts?" "Because ghosts don't lie." That stopped her. Not the words, but the quiet certainty of them. He moved past her to drop more wood into the fire. The blaze snapped and flared, casting his shadow up against the far wall. Tall, jagged, flickering like a warning. Outside, the light had begun to fade. Too early for sunset. Lyra stood and crossed to the door, opened it. The cold met her like a slap, but she didn't care. The wind was back. Not wild. Just whispering. She stepped out far enough for her boots to sink into the snow. Her breath plumed in front of her like smoke. In the distance, she saw something dark against the white. Just for a second. A flicker of motion. She squinted. Gone. Behind her, the door creaked. Calvin stood in the threshold watching her with that same unreadable stillness. "You see it too," she said. He nodded once. "They're testing the line." Her chest tightened. "How many?" "Doesn't matter." He glanced toward the tree line. "They're not ready yet. Just watching." Her fingers curled around the doorframe. "They're not the only ones watching." He said nothing, but she saw it in the set of his jaw. The way his eyes lingered on her longer than necessary. Back inside, she lit one of the oil lamps hanging from a wooden beam. The light flickered weakly, casting the walls in sepia. She felt hollow, but not empty. Like something was making space inside her, pushing old things out. When she finally lay down, she didn't close her eyes. The fire still burned, its light dancing across the wooden ceiling. She felt him still, across the room, unmoving, half shadow, half man. The bond stretched between them like a cord pulled taut but uncut. Not desire, not yet, something older, recognition, and somewhere inside her. Syl stirred, quiet and waiting, teeth bared in the dark. Chapter 6, Fire in the Spine. The forest had changed its breath again. Lyra felt it before she even opened her eyes. An atmospheric shift, subtle and unsettling, like the earth itself was drawing in a quiet inhale, holding it beneath ice. Her skin prickled beneath the blanket, not from cold this time, but from something unseen and internal. Beneath the warmth of the hearth, her body remained still, yet her chest felt like it was moving without her, rising and falling with a rhythm not entirely her own. When she sat up, Calvin was already gone. She had stopped being surprised by that. He moved through the days like a creature born from ritual, as though every hour was just another shape of silence to fit inside. She dressed slowly, her limbs heavy, her mind restless. Something stirred in the bones beneath her spine. Not pain, not quite, but pressure, dull and thick, like the ghost of something yet to arrive. Outside, frost clung to every surface with an unnatural stubbornness. The light was gray, indistinct, as if the sun had forgotten how to climb. Calvin stood near the tree line, arms crossed, his eyes tracking nothing visible. He didn't acknowledge her as she approached. He didn't need to. She followed him into the trees without speaking, her boots crunching softly behind his heavier steps. The snow had a strange tension to it, crusted, resistant, a layer of ice over something deeper and looser underneath. It reminded her of her own skin these past few days, as if the surface she wore no longer matched what lived inside it. They returned to the same clearing, the one with claw marks etched into trunks and branches shaped by years of friction. The forest here seemed to listen differently. The air hung heavy, saturated with old breath. Calvin gestured to the center, then stepped away without a word. She walked to it. Her body responded with slow defiance, like a door half swollen in its frame. When she closed her eyes, the cold sharpened against her lids. She let the air fill her lungs. It didn't comfort. It scraped. At first nothing moved, her heartbeat remained steady. Her thoughts drifted from the fire's smell in her hair to the sound of her own breath. But something deeper clawed upward, just slightly, like fingers trailing along the inside of her spine. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The tension slid down the back of her neck, a shiver without cold. There had been no instruction, no name spoken, yet something ancient flickered beneath her skin, an intelligence she had never dared disturb. Her breath hitched. The air around her shifted. Pressure built with slow cruelty. It wasn't pain exactly, but it splintered through her ribs like an old wound stretching open. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the snow with a gasp she hadn't meant to make. The world blurred. The wind pressed close, wrapping her in scent and static. She couldn't tell where her limbs ended and the ground began. A flicker, barely more than instinct, flared in her chest. It wasn't thought. It wasn't memory. It was presence. Something inside her had awakened just long enough to open a single eye. Then came the searing twist behind her heart, heat crawling low through her spine, curling like flame into her lungs. She clawed her hands into the snow, trying to ground herself, but the earth no longer felt solid. Her body felt too tight, as though it belonged to something else entirely. And in that moment it did. For a single breath, Syl pushed forward. There were no words, no voice. Just the weight of being seen from the inside out. Her wolf did not ask for permission. She simply existed, hot, wild, and furious in her hunger. Lyra's vision flared white. The pain was appealing, a rending, a fall into a shape she did not understand. Every inch of her body rebelled. Her mouth opened in a sound that wasn't hers. Then came stillness. Terrible, trembling stillness. When her eyes opened, the world had changed. Trees towered like monuments. The snow glistened in detail she'd never noticed. The pattern of crushed flakes, the way bark held warmth long after light faded. Sound moved differently. Scent was no longer a hint in the air, but a language written across every branch and stone. She looked down and saw pause. Her breath, if it was breath, came faster, lighter. Her new form trembled with disorientation. Her mind blurred and sharpened in strange rhythms, thoughts slipping sideways into instinct. Her wolf was awake. Not fully in control. Not completely separated. But real. Calvin watched from the edge of the clearing. He had not moved. The wind caught his coat, and for a moment, the animal in her smelled him in total. The scent burned through her like a spark along old tinder. Recognition flared, too sharp to be ignored. The mate bond pulsed beneath it all. Not loud, not overpowering, but insistent. Not a pull toward him, but a gravity. Her body had already decided what her mind refused to name. She approached him slowly, paws crunching in measured steps. The way he stood, utterly still, neither welcoming nor retreating, unsettled her. He allowed her near. That was all. But his wolf, riven, stirred beneath his gaze. She felt it, not in words, not in presence, but in pressure. Two beings circling a quiet thread of fate. She brushed past him, her flank grazing the edge of his coat. He flinched, but only internally. His breath caught, and she felt the restraint in it like steel wire held in tension. The air between them bent. A second later, she turned and trotted back toward the cabin, limbs awkward but sure. When she crossed the threshold, her form shifted again. Not smoothly, not beautifully. Her knees hit the floor. Her shoulders cracked. The pain felt old, earned. She collapsed near the hearth, breathing ragged. Every muscle trembled. But she wasn't afraid. Calvin entered moments later and didn't speak. He tossed a blanket beside her, neither rough nor gentle. She reached for it slowly, her hand unsteady, her breath still catching on the memory of pause. Their eyes met briefly. His were unreadable, but he looked at her differently now. Not as a captive, not as a stranger, as something else. Chapter 7. What was stolen? The forest held its breath. Snow drifted lazily from the gray sky, soft enough to muffle every sound, yet something beneath the surface vibrated. Not wind, not weather. Something alive. Waiting. Watching. Lyra knelt beside the cabin's hearth, fingers trailing the grain of the floorboards. Her body still carried the phantom memory of fur and claw, of wind slicing past her ears and earth beneath her paws. Every nerve still burned faintly, not from pain but from distance. Syl was awake now, not fully, not constant, but present in every step, in every breath. Calvin hadn't spoken much since the shift. She caught him watching her sometimes, eyes fixed in that still, unreadable way of his. Not distant, never that, but weighed down, like everything he saw came through the veil of something lost long ago. She didn't ask what he was thinking. There was no use in reaching for pieces of a man who only revealed what he couldn't bury. It was midday when the quiet changed. She felt it before anything, a wrongness, a crack in the air like a howl caught behind the teeth of the wind. Calvin was already at the door. No alarm in his movements, only readiness. He stepped into the clearing, coat barely fastened, and stared into the trees as if they'd spoken. Lyra followed, not far behind. The snow wasn't untouched. Tracks, faint but deliberate, marked a curve through the northern tree line. Too far for scent, too careful for chance. The edges of each paw print were sharp, not from haste, but precision. Whoever had made them wasn't running. They were circling. She didn't speak. Calvin didn't need her to. They moved together, skirting the cabin's edge, weaving through the frozen brush where the trees stood thinner. The sky had darkened without warning. No storm, just shadow thickening. The smell of pine turned stale in her nose, as if the forest itself had soured. They found the first body near the river's bend. Small, lean fur still clinging to its half-shifted shape. The throat was torn, but not cleanly. Not for hunger. For message. A scout, perhaps. One of the ashen fangs sent ahead, only to be met by something worse. Calvin crouched low, fingers brushing the torn flank. He turned the body gently, examining without judgment. His expression remained flat, but Lyra saw the muscle in his jaw twitch once. Riven stirred behind his eyes. She felt it again. That weight inside the bond. Not affection, not protection. A calculation. As if his wolf was deciding who else needed to die before the danger passed. They didn't take the body back, there was no point. Instead, Calvin began marking something into the snow with a length of bone he pulled from his belt. Lyra watched in silence, slowly recognizing the shape he carved. It wasn't just a warning. It was a claim. A symbol that had not been used in years. The rogue's mark, not pack, not alpha, but not prey either. They returned to the cabin by nightfall. The fire had burned low again, the cold already creeping back through the seams of the walls. Lyra took up her place near it, dragging one of the older pelts across her shoulders. Calvin moved toward the table without speaking, fingers drifting over the corner of one of the old maps. He shifted several pages aside and revealed something new. A drawing, hand-sketched, faded but preserved. Two faces, one unmistakably Cassian's, the other took her longer to recognize. It was younger, unscarred, But the shape of the jaw, the eyes, it was Calvin. Not as he was now, but as he might have been. Before exile, before silence. Her throat tightened. He left it there untouched and walked away. She stared at it long after he was gone, the fire painting orange light across the faded graphite. There was something else beneath the drawing. Another map, different from the others. Hand-copied, not Bloodfang territory, a broader reach. Marks scattered along its edges, symbols, not letters. Some circled, some slashed. One, closest to their current location, was marked with a jagged line, like a wound carved into the page. She traced it lightly with one fingertip. The ink had bled outward, as if pressed too hard. A sudden gust of wind hit the cabin hard enough to rattle the shutters. Lyra froze, then rose. She crossed to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped into the dark. The forest was alive again, but not with peace. The air buzzed faintly, wrong in the way blood tastes when bitten. Her wolf didn't speak, but her body braced, not in fear, in warning. Somewhere in the distance something howled. Not a call, a challenge. Calvin appeared at her side a heartbeat later, his chest rising in slow, deep breaths. He said nothing, only looked toward the sound as though he already knew who it belonged to. The wind shifted again, and this time she caught it. A scent she hadn't smelled since the Bloodfang stronghold. Amber, iron, cold sweat under expensive leather. Garen. The name didn't leave her mouth, but it curled through her like frost on a wound. She looked up at Calvin. His face had hardened into something neither human nor wolf. Just a man caught between, waiting for the past to arrive wearing teeth. Chapter 8. The Mark. The storm didn't come with thunder or wind. It came with silence. The kind of silence that hummed in the joints of the trees and stretched across the frozen ground like a shroud. Even the snow held its breath, suspended in the air in motionless flakes, waiting to fall. Lyra stood just beyond the threshold, the cold leaching through the soles of her boots. The forest had swallowed Garen's scent already, but she still tasted it on the back of her tongue. Sour, bitter, false. She didn't need to see him to know. He was close. Closer than he should have been. Too far from Bloodfang borders to be acting on anyone's orders but his own. She stepped back inside, slow, controlled. Calvin stood by the table, hands braced on either side, head bowed. His shoulders moved in a rhythm she didn't recognize at first. Too slow for breath, too still for tension. Then she saw his fingers, curled into the edge of the wood like they were holding him in place. The bond between them buzzed faintly, the thread tightening in the space between silence and speech. She didn't ask how he knew Garen had come. Some knowledge didn't need explanation. It lived in the marrow of those who'd bled for it. He reached beneath the maps, fingers moving with reluctant familiarity, and pulled out something wrapped in faded cloth. A bundle, long and narrow. He unrolled it without ceremony. Inside was a strip of torn leather, darker than age should have left it, still holding the shape of something once worn close to the skin. It wasn't a collar, not quite. Not a mark of rank. It was something else. A bond mark, cut, half-finished, never sealed. Lyra moved closer without meaning to. There was a symbol carved into the leather, shallow but sharp, a wolf split in two halves, one upright, one inverted, twin beasts staring in opposite directions, mouths open but never meeting. She'd seen it once before in a book her father kept sealed in his study, bound in metal and dust. It hadn't been labeled. It didn't need to be. She looked at Calvin, but he still hadn't raised his head. There were stories, whispers about secret bonds, forbidden ties between heirs and warriors, never sanctioned by the Alpha line. Not just love, not even desire. Loyalty, deeper than instinct. Connections made in blood, not tradition. She didn't need him to tell her now. The bond mark hadn't belonged to her father. It hadn't belonged to the Alpha. It had belonged to Cassian. And Calvin had worn it. He finally looked up. His face was unreadable, but there was something hollow behind his eyes. Not the kind of hollow left by time or exile, but by betrayal carved deep and left to rot. The past didn't just weigh on him, it lived inside him. The bond he'd once carried had been buried in silence, and now, piece by piece, it clawed back toward the surface. He didn't speak, but she felt the truth before the pieces aligned. Cassian hadn't died because of war, or wolves, or rogue misjudgment. He had died because of a secret he should have kept, and a truth he trusted to the wrong person. Lyra reached for the leather, fingers hovering just above the mark. Her skin tingled before she made contact, as if it still held memory, as if pain could be passed down like scent. Calvin's voice, when it came, was quiet, rough around the edges. He knew Garen was selling territory maps to the Ashen Fangs. He came to me with it, not to report, to run. Her hand froze, the maps, the border marks, the patterns carved across the forest floor. He begged me not to tell your father, Calvin continued, said the corruption ran deeper than we thought, said it wouldn't matter, that it was already too late. Lyra couldn't look away from the mark. Every breath she took pressed harder against her ribs, as if the truth had hands. I was supposed to go with him that night, but I waited too long. He said nothing more. The fire crackled faintly behind them, the only sound in the room. Outside, snow began to fall again, this time in silence so complete it felt unnatural. Lyra stepped back from the table, the weight of the room settling in her chest like ash. Calvin rolled the leather back into the cloth and tucked it away beneath the maps, hiding it without urgency, as if the act itself was more ritual than concealment. He didn't apologize, didn't ask for understanding. But something inside him had shifted, a crack in the wall. She crossed the cabin slowly, stood near the hearth, and pressed her hands close to the flames. The warmth did little to ease the pressure building beneath her skin. Her wolf stirred again, not loudly, not with words, but with awareness. Syl understood things before Lyra could explain them, and Syl was listening. There was no comfort in the revelation, no relief in the truth, only clarity. Garen hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to finish what was started. They wouldn't be safe here much longer. Not in the cabin, not in the trees, not anywhere. Calvin moved to the window, eyes on the tree line. His wolf pulsed faintly through the bond, Riven's presence a low growl under his skin. No fear. Just a readiness sharpened by guilt. Lyra didn't speak, but she understood. They would have to leave, not to escape it, but to end it. The mark was no longer just memory, it was motive. Chapter 9. The Broken Throne. The trees thinned as dawn broke across the ridgeline, bleeding light like old blood over the hills. Lyra walked with the taste of metal in her mouth, heart steady but heavy, each step toward Bloodfang territory dragging a shadow behind it. The forest had narrowed into silence, no longer wild, but watching. The cold felt different now, less biting, more indifferent, like a truth that no longer needed to prove itself. She moved alongside Calvin without words, there was no need. Their steps had long since fallen into rhythm. What lived between them didn't require sound. It pulsed quietly beneath the skin, in glances, in breath, in every pause that had once been distance. The path into the valley wasn't hidden, only forgotten. Overgrown stones marked the edge of the border, a place once patrolled, now abandoned. Bloodfang no longer guarded this entrance. They hadn't needed to. No one came back this way. Calvin had returned here once before, that much she knew. Years ago, alone, hunted, marked, but not broken. Now he came again, not to beg, not to bargain. He carried no flag of peace, only memory, and the truth they had buried with Cassian. Lyra's breath clouded the air. Her wolf stirred just beneath her ribs, coiled but calm, as if Syl understood this was not her moment to rise. Not yet. This was the girl's reckoning, not the beast's. They waited until the sun had breached the tree line before crossing the threshold. The land inside was different than she remembered, smaller, sharper. The buildings once carved from stone and command now looked brittle in the morning light. Too many walls, not enough wilderness, power that had forgotten its roots. The ceremony grounds stood empty. Snow half melted into the black stone circle, edges still stained from the last binding ritual she had fled. She stepped over them now, unbound, unclaimed, and more wolf than woman. Calvin remained behind her, close but separate, a presence, not a shield. Eyes began to gather from doorways, windows, balconies. Heads turned. No one spoke. No alarm rang out. Only that thick, pack-trained hush, the kind taught into the bones of wolves raised beneath an alpha's rule. Then came Garen. He stepped from the council hall like a man who expected to be obeyed, still dressed in the ceremonial black, the mark of Beta carved into the leather at his throat. The smile he wore barely touched his eyes. Lyra didn't stop walking. She entered the circle without hesitation, boots scraping against the old runes carved into the stone, the cold bit at her wrists. Her jaw clenched once. She raised her chin. Garen approached with the slow patience of a wolf who still believed himself the predator. "You've returned," he said. "Alone?" She didn't answer. "You were missed," he continued, glancing once over her shoulder before returning his gaze to hers. Though perhaps not by all. A flicker of movement pulled the air tight. Calvin had stepped into view. Murmurs rippled outward like sound breaking through water. The name didn't need to be spoken. It had never truly left this place. Rogue. Exile. Killer. But now he stood in the center of their power, unspeaking, unapologetic. Garen's smile faltered. Lyra's voice, when it came, cut clean. "You killed Cassian." A hush dropped like a blade. Her father stepped from the shadows behind Garen. Alpha Theron, still tall, still robed in the colors of his rule, but smaller somehow, older, not in body, but in presence. Like something inside him had stopped growing, long ago. He said nothing. Garen's jaw twitched, then set. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I know what Calvin saw, what Cassian died to protect." She took another step forward, eyes locked. "You sold map routes to the Ashen Fangs. Cassian found out. He trusted the wrong wolf to save him." Still, her father said nothing. Garen moved a step forward, measured, calm. But Lyra felt the shift in him, the restraint thinning. Calvin hadn't spoken, but now he did. Only one word. "Enough." It wasn't loud, but it echoed through the stone. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, and dropped something into the snow. The torn bond mark. The symbol glared up at them. Two wolves, mirrored and split. Cassian's. The one meant for Calvin. Never sealed. Left behind. A piece of the truth no longer willing to stay buried. Gasps rippled again, movement, uncertainty. Garen lunged. It wasn't dramatic. No roar, no shift. Just sudden, sharp movement. A hand reaching for the hilt at his side, a blade glinting in the light. But Calvin was already there. Not rushing, not flinching, just moving like a man who had already seen this moment play out too many times to be surprised by it. The knife never touched skin. Calvin's hand closed around Garen's wrist. Bones cracked beneath the pressure. Garen dropped to one knee, breath torn from him. Not from pain, from realization. He wasn't the strongest wolf here, not anymore. Calvin stepped back, released him. Garen stayed down. Lyra turned to face her father. He looked at her like he didn't recognize what she had become. She didn't offer an explanation, and she didn't need his approval. When she stepped back from the circle, the mark still bleeding its truth into the snow, she knew the old throne had cracked, not shattered, not yet. But enough. Chapter 10. What Remains of the Wild. The snow hadn't stopped falling, not entirely. It came in soft waves now, light as ash, covering the old circle stone by stone. Within a day the footprints would vanish, the blood too, as if nothing had happened, as if the truths carved into the earth had been swallowed whole by the sky. Lyra didn't look back when they left the Bloodfang grounds. She didn't need to. The scent of the place was already fading behind her, replaced by pine, river moss, the distant pull of wind through the high trees. Her father hadn't spoken another word. Garen had been taken, injured, humiliated, but breathing. The council had said nothing. They hadn't needed to. The silence that followed a fracture was always the loudest. It echoed. She and Calvin crossed the border before sunrise, moving in silence, not from fear, but from understanding. This was not a victory worth celebrating. Only surviving, only enduring. The wild welcomed them back without judgment. By the time they reached the cabin again, the world had shifted once more. Not changed, just returned. Like something displaced had slid back into place. Smoke had long since faded from the chimney. The hearth was cold. The floorboards creaked the same. And yet the air inside the walls felt different now. Not haunted, not lonely, just still. Lyra stood in the doorway, her fingers brushing the frame as if checking whether it still fit her. It did. Just barely. Calvin didn't speak. He dropped his coat by the door and crossed to the fire without ceremony. Wood hit the stone with soft, solid thuds. Sparks soon followed. The light spread slowly, licking the walls, casting everything in that familiar gold again. She watched him work, hands practiced, movements quiet, and felt the weight of it all catch up to her. Not like a collapse, not like exhaustion, more like a tide reaching shore. Everything she had carried had finally made it home. She didn't need to say thank you, not for the cabin, not for the fire, not even for the way he had stood beside her when it mattered most. He hadn't done it for thanks, and he hadn't done it for forgiveness. He had done it because she was hers and he was his, and somehow, that had become enough. When he finally looked at her, his face didn't hold softness. It never had. But it held the truth. The kind that didn't need permission. She crossed the room and sat by the hearth. Her hands reached toward the flames, palms open, as if warming herself for the first time in days. Maybe she was. He settled nearby, not touching, not speaking, but close enough that the firelight painted across both their faces in the same rhythm. They remained like that for a while. Two creatures carved by exile, side by side, not healed, not whole, but no longer running. At some point her hand found his, not by design, not for comfort, just to rest. He didn't pull away. Outside, the wind shifted. Her eyes drifted toward the window, the trees beyond layered in frost and distance. She could feel Syl inside her now, not loud, not demanding, just present. A low hum beneath her heartbeat, a shared breath. Calvin's wolf was quieter still, but she knew Riven watched through him, listened through him. Always had. There was no spoken claim, no ceremony. That had never been their story. But when her fingers curled slightly around his and his thumb dragged once across her knuckles, rough, warm, unthinking, she knew. This was the bond, finally laid bare. Not fated, not forced, chosen, and in that quiet, in the flicker between their two shadows on the cabin wall, something like peace settled. Not the soft kind, not safety, but truth. Outside, the wild stirred again, unruly, untamed, unconcerned with what the packs thought, or who sat on thrones of stone and title. The forest didn't care about exile or legacy, but it remembered those who bled into it, and it made room for those who returned.